Order.
Need a gap.
All right.
Pick my mates.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Catherine. That was very effective. Hello, everyone. Hello on Zoom as well. This is our penultimate seminar for the fall quarter. And it was supposed to be our postdoc, Sam Bradshaw, but for the best of reasons, which is that she has a job talk, Dinsha, who is a former CBDRL postdoc, is going to present on a new edited volume about India. So we are so happy that he filled in last minute and also so excited to learn about this research. So the most important element of his bio is that he was at the CBDRL in 2015 to 16 as a postdoc. He is now a research fellow at the Hoover Institute and also at the Rule of Law and Non-Law program at Stanford Law School. He studies governance and economic growth in developing countries, and today we'll be presenting new work on India.
Thank you. Nice to get the applause beforehand. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I don't think my clicker is working, but there goes. All right. If that's all the technical difficulties we have today, hopefully we'll be running well. Yeah. So this is sort of the genesis of the project that I'm going to be speaking about today. So Larry and Sumit had edited a book with another fellow, Mark Plattner, a couple of years ago in 2007. And we thought for a variety of reasons, it was a good time to revisit this project. This book was written, well edited, and there was a lot of optimism at the time about Indian democracy. Another book that came out at around the same time, the title sort of tells you the success of India's democracy. There were a lot of books coming out in these early 2000s, even towards the early 2010s, talking about how promising, how great, how strong the world's largest democracy appeared. However, if you've been following the news, you've probably seen a lot of stuff that's been changing with respect to Indian democracy. The title of this project is The Troubling State of India's Democracy, which is a little bit of a, I guess, tells you what we're going to be talking about today. What's happened, why things have changed, and then what we can expect to happen in the future. Just by way of what we're going to be doing today, with edited books, it's usually pretty hard. You don't want to really just get lost in each chapter, especially if there's no grand thesis. In this book, the approach has been much more inductive. So I thought instead of just going over and boringly reviewing each chapter, I'd give a step back and talk a little bit about the brief background on Indian democracy. What's the state? How does that inform what scholars should be thinking about? What kinds of labels we should be using? And then maybe a little bit of prognosticating in danger. I think political scientists lose their license sometimes when they do this, but it's a fun thing to do. And we actually brought together 18 or 20 of the world's leading experts on Indian democracy, and we were having meetings pretty regularly last year. And this is something that we would all talk about and discuss and debate. So it won't just be my sort of navel gazing. It's 20 other people. So India's remarkable democracy. Let me just tell you a little bit about the background of the system. So experiments with democracy started for the most part during the colonial era, where they started to run local elections. Even before then, you can find some evidence that there were elections happening in pockets prior to Europeans entering India. In 1947, India gains independence. And the country, for the most part, is really committed to a democratic future. A prime minister is selected in 1947, Nehru, but they consolidate this democracy. They formally frame it in 1950 with the Constitution. It's at the time focused on being a liberal, democratic, parliamentary federal system. They have a socialist bend, of course, as well, but these elements are definitely enshrined in the Constitution itself. For the first 25 years in the country, first 28 years, depending on how you want to count, they're free and fair elections, top to bottom. Congress Party dominates, sort of like what we see in South Africa post-1994. One party dominates, but the election's widely regarded as free and fair. From 75 to 77, we get this emergency period, 19 months, where Indira Gandhi takes over the country, delays elections. And then for reasons that scholars are thinking about now, we've seen 3 books actually in the last year on the emergency period, oftentimes sort of portending with what we're seeing in India right now. But for reasons that none of those books can really explain, it seems like she wakes up one morning and says emergency is over. This isn't what we're seeing in Pakistan. This isn't what we're seeing in Egypt with similar emergencies taking place there. But she ends emergency and calls for elections. She faces a lot of trials during that period. An opposition party comes in, but she comes back and wins power in 1980. Post 1977, not just those opposition parties have come in, but also Indira in the 1980s, as well as her subsequent Congress members. They put in a lot of institutional protections to try and stop stuff like this from happening again. So Indira's legacy in this dimension is quite complex, but things like trying to make sure that the courts were immune to political pressure, trying to make it so that parties would have some more checks on them, various kinds of safeguards on the police and other structures like that that we care about. A lot of institutional development happened post this emergency period. So things seem to be going well. And then in 2014, Modi and the BJP come to power. The BJP had come to power previously from 97 to 2003, but the flavor of BJP that comes in 2014 is different, as I'll talk about today. Why should we care about all of this? Well, as of today, India is about 35% of the democratic population of the world. Oftentimes when we look at most democratic studies, we put 60 countries up. India is approximately the same size as Latin America and Western Europe, right? So pretty much any theory of democracy that you're thinking about has to run through this, right? And I just add, for instance, that probably the thing that we all learn in grad school in year one is about the third wave of democracy. If India is turning, that's on a magnitude, on a scale that would be comparable to the third wave. So we're talking about a pretty big dynamic here. This is one of the reasons why Larry and Sumit and I agreed that it was worthy of close study. So Modi and the BJP. This is Modi. This is actually an image that will appear in our book. It comes from his Twitter profile. He's got ducks wandering around. He's reading it's actually a pink newspaper, the Financial Times. He's got a biography of Barack Obama sitting there. And he's trying to present himself in this picture as a modern sort of reformer. He advertises himself in different dimensions that we can talk about on social media. But that's our man right there. So he was born in a small town in Gujarat in 1950. This is actually a really sort of inspiring story. Comes from very humble origins and then rises to take over this country. At the age of 8, he joins this group, the RSS, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. It's a Hindu radical organization. It's really hard to say what the analog of that would be to a Western audience. It's politically inclined, but it's not a political party. So it has elements that look like the Hitler Youth, and it was inspired by the Hitler Youth movement, but it's not exactly along those lines. In 1985, the RSS assigns Modi to the BJP. The BJP at this stage is a nascent political party, an agglomeration of a lot of opposition parties that emerged following independence. Modi rises very quickly, and he becomes the chief minister of one of the largest states of Gujarat in 2001. Modi himself doesn't actually rise through the political machinery of the party. He comes up through the parties. He's not standing for local level elections and owing his loyalty to various kinds of elected leaders. He's coming up through the mechanisms of the party separately. And then he becomes the chief minister in 2001. In 2002, he oversees, some might say leads, these Gujarat riots. He clearly plays a very strong hand in it, where 3,000 Muslims are killed. And far from that costing him politically, that seems to actually galvanize and really help him politically. He's reelected in Gujarat with thumping majorities in 2007 and then again in 2012. And then in 2014, he is the candidate of choice for the BJP. This is their symbol. Political parties in India all have symbols, the lotus flower with the saffron color. So in 2014, he leads the BJP to national elections and they win. And in 2019, they win again, both times with the majority government and very convincingly. The opposition really gets thumped pretty resoundingly. I mentioned the RSS. Let me just tell you a little bit of a backstory about Hindutva, this idea of what it means to be Hindu and what it means to be Indian. Historically, this has been defined by Gandhi, and Gandhi promoted a creedal inclusive notion of what this Hindu Indian identity meant. Samja, who's a fellow, or I guess a fellow at CDDR,
I've seen them.
yeah, he calls this Gandhi's gift, right? This idea that we can have something that, it might be based on a religious idea, but it's something bigger than just a religion. It's not promoting one religion over something else. At the same time, even back in Gandhi's day, from the very start, you've got more radical groups that are promoting an idea of Hindu supremacy, which is what we call Hindutva. The idea that India needs to be run by Hindus for Hindus to the exclusion of other groups. And this is also not only consolidating the politics and the party machinery in India, but it's also affecting the religious structures in the country, right? For the most part, Hinduism has been a disaggregated religion. They're trying to define it, what it means to be Hindu. They're trying to do that as well. So that project's taking place. Post-Gandhi, at least in the political realm, in the state realm, Gandhi's legacy, he was just a towering figure in Indian politics. Gandhi's legacy really looms large. And for the most part, if you want to define yourself as an Indian, if you want to define yourself as Hindu, for the most part, that tends to be more of a secular Gandhian sort of vision of what it means to be Hindu. Hindutva itself, it's in the background, but it's not really, getting very much political traction. So by the 1990s, that starts to change. Certainly by 2002, with the Gujarat riots that Modi oversees, there's a realization, I would say politically, that Hindutva can be a recipe for winning elections. Today, the Gandhian legacy, it's probably not fair to say it's missing, but there's no real champion of it. We don't really have people running around saying this is what it would mean to be inclusive and what the Indian state should be in terms of a secular Indian state, or what Hinduism should be apart from an anti-Muslim sort of state. There are people who are trying to redefine that. So one of my colleagues at Hoover, Raghuram Rajan, who is the central bank governor, he's trying to think about that, and I think he's probably preparing for a political run. Congress Party itself they have some of the voices, but they haven't really been getting behind those voices. And for the most part, that party has lacked ideology for quite a while. So that's the state of what's going on right now with identity. I mentioned the RSS. This is Modi taking pledge with, shoulder to shoulder with leaders of the RSS. He does a lot of activities with them as well. And they've been instrumental in developing the BJP as well as in helping Modi win. So within the BJP, Modi's power within these groups comes from winning elections. He's not the most ideological person. He does claim to be. He's not the most policy strong person. He claims to be, but he's had a lot of misses. It's unclear what would happen if he lost a major election, and we can talk a little bit more about this. It's also not really clear what would happen if he were to just collapse and who would succeed him. He's done a lot while maintaining the machinery at the lower levels to make sure that there aren't too many checks on his power. This might sound similar to what people in other countries are seeing who study populist leaders. The party is, for the most part, strong and loyal. This is a nice cartoon. They did a cabinet reshuffle a few months ago, and you've got all of these people who are basically dancing to Modi's music. I think this is quite telling. He gets rid of people who are either too powerful or are too incompetent, and sort of wants that middle-level person that will deliver on what he wants. A lot of decisions now, including some of the stuff that I've been working on, the decisions have to be routed through the Prime Minister's office. So a lot of other nodes outside of the party as well within the bureaucracy, those decisions, even though they're not supposed to be, get turned over to him to make. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now where he's really centralizing both political as well as state power. Again, no clear successor. So when I said there was a 2014-2019 national elections, the BJP came in a thumping majority. You can see the map here. For the most part, this is the distribution of where the BJP really is strong in their alliance, the NDA. So Gujarat is right around here, and this is, whoops, I touched the screen and I said I would. This is called the Hindi belt. So up in the north, they've always been in the last 10 years, they've been very strong. Going further south, they've had a lot of struggles getting into the south. South India, language is still a big political issue, and South India does not want to speak Hindi. It's more complicated than that, of course, and there are stronger regional political parties that play pretty well there. But this is where Modi has been concentrating his efforts, and the BJP has seen a lot of success. Of course, some of these areas, you can't really tell with this map, but just this little circle right here that I'm doing is 220 million people. That's UP. So we're talking about pretty large populations there. So why are we concerned about democracy? What does the data tell us? So this is something that Larry and one of his RAs prepared for us for the book. We've got the three major measures for democracy. And we see since Modi came to power in 2014, that they've all regressed across Freedom House, BDEM, and the EIU. We're seeing declines in democracy. And then if you actually go into the numbers, this is the Freedom House's Freedom in the World indicators. It's not really declining on political rights. Political rights is an electoral measure. For the most part, free and fair elections continue, although we'll talk a little bit about how that's changing subsequent to 2020. It's not really declining in terms of the rule of law. People still, for the most part, feel like they can get justice. There has been a little bit of a dip. The main thing that we're seeing is a decline in civil liberties. And this has actually pulled Freedom House's classification of India down from a free democracy, a free country, to a partly free country as of 2020. It just happened this year. Sumit and Larry were emailing very excitedly when that happened with us. So civil liberties in decline beyond just numbers. Let me put up some headlines so you can get a sense of what's going on. Veer Das was a comedian who was earlier this week presented at the Kennedy Center and said some things about India that were received in a negative light back in his country, back in India. A BJP leader took him to court there, and now he's facing trial if he comes home. Twitter account, Twitter right now, it seems to be hand in glove with the ruling party. They shut down 68 handles, this article says, and tweets are being taken down for opposition. What those tweets were, it was just typical government criticism. I wouldn't say it went over any line. And then this happened. Salman Qureshi, who used to be the foreign minister of the country, his house was set on fire. He wrote a book last month about Ayodhya, one of the big movements that happened in India, and compared Hindutva movement to a terrorist movement. All three of these articles were pulled last night, by the way. So this is what the news is saying on an almost regular basis. This isn't even the biggest stuff. This is just what I found when I opened my computer at 2 p.m. Right. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing on a very constant basis. Big stuff, I would say, really big challenges to foreign minister of a country is a pretty big deal. All the way to the Triton Banal, I would say the comedian, and then of course, more local level interference in Tripura. So this
Why does it say no one burnt my cottage? Like, is he saying that
he's saying that
the government claims nobody did it?
So the government claimed that, but then also he's saying that we shouldn't be blaming one person. This is an ideology that burned my cottage.
I got it. Thanks.
And so he's using it to galvanize in that direction. So, but it's concerning nonetheless. So the state of the opposition. So there's no question that the ruling government is undermining opposition parties, and we can talk a little bit about that. We saw that on the last page. But also the parties themselves, the opposition, have really been broken down considerably. Congress Party today has less than 10% of the parliament. Officially, to form opposition in parliament, one party has to be able to claim 10% of the seats, and they can't. That has all kinds of implications for appointments to various parts of the Indian government. You actually have to, the prime minister, along with the leader of the opposition, have to agree to who gets appointed. Because there is no official leader of the opposition, BJP is saying we don't have to consult, we're just going to appoint. Congress also has only a few state governments. So earlier I had shown you a map of parliamentary national elections. This is a map of state governments and who controls what. The BJP NDA alliance is in orange or shades of orange. We've got Congress in blue with their alliance members in shades of blue, and then other parties. Our great hope at CDDRL, we keep bringing Aam Aadmi Party members. They've got Delhi right there, that little bright green dot. I don't know if you can see it, and hopefully they'll win elsewhere too. But they haven't had a lot of luck going beyond that little area.
Is that the anti-corruption party?
That's historically been the anti-corruption party. When Eric and I took a class right before the 2019 elections, we asked them why they had gotten away from that plank, and they had gotten away from that plank. But it's still a relatively good government party. So they came to power on an anti-corruption plank, that's for sure. So the Congress itself, and this is worthy of further study, it suffered from problematic leadership and really just a hollowing out of the party machinery. This is a party that developed originally in the 1870s and then was controlling the country for the bulk of the period. Even from 2004 to 2014, they had the country for the most part under control. But the leadership, people say with Indira Gandhi, she personalized the leadership of the party quite a lot. So she made sure that a lot of the machinery wouldn't work as well. And then if you meet somebody from Congress today, they're almost certainly a legacy. Their father, their mother, their grandparents, they were involved in Congress. So they're not really promoting from within, at least not meritocratically. The machinery oftentimes relies on who you're related to, rather than anything really of substance. So they don't get the greatest performance, people who perform the best. I can give you an anecdote. In 2019, everybody was saying social media would be a really big thing for the elections. Congress didn't really put together a social media campaign until about 3 or 4 weeks before the election. They gave the contracts for that to Sam Petroda, who was relevant in the 1980s. He came up with India's telecom policy. He's based in Illinois too. So, he's not the person you would turn to for that. And you certainly wouldn't do it 3 or 4 weeks beforehand. But that's what happened. And that speaks to the incompetence of that party. The party itself has been led by Rahul Gandhi, who's overseen 2 successive national election losses. And unfortunately, will probably oversee a 3rd. So there's a lot of bad stuff happening with that party itself. There's a little bit more hope with the regional parties, but the regional parties, it's always hard for them to come together. And there's really no serious national challenger at this point. We've got some state elections coming up, including in UP, the state of 200 million people. We've got state elections in Gujarat, in some of these other states. For the most part, BJP is going to be on its heels. And these will be quite important telling states to understand what the future of Indian democracy looks like, especially what we see in UP. There are a couple of really, really strong regional parties there. If they can work together and coalesce, or if they can bring Congress in, then at the national level, we might see some hope for a combined resistance in 2024 when we see national elections. So here's a little bit about UP. Population of 200 million, 50 million are Muslim. The Muslim vote usually divides along 2 of the opposition parties. For all kinds of reasons, they've struggled to partner. I mean, you can read the academic stuff on this book, but some of this other stuff, it's just like, backstabbing stories and things like that. The BJP also encourages these kinds of divides. It's just crazy what happens. They'll pick off popular members, they'll buy off people who they think might win. Just all kinds of really dirty politics happen at this level. And then, as I mentioned, if we see the opposition successfully coalescing and not doing this kind of stuff, or not being interfered with as the BJP does this kind of stuff, could be a really promising start for national elections where we might see some kind of regional party alliance or Congress alliance. In this state, this used to be Congress's strongest state. This is where they would put up their prime ministerial candidates when they didn't want to challenge. Congress has got 5 seats out of 403 in the state right now. This just speaks to their utter basically incompetence, I would say. The state also appoints 12% of the upper house of parliament in India. So they've got a similar system to what the US had prior to 1916. So they can appoint a lot at the national level if the if the opposition parties win out. So what are we seeing? Just to give you a brief summary of where we are so far. Declines in civil liberties and political rights, important institutions, including institutions of horizontal accountability, as Larry calls them, they're increasingly compromised. National power of the state machinery is consolidating in the Prime Minister's office. In terms of the party system, BJP, RSS, organized, ideologically aligned for the most part, and rival national political parties, which is not there or they're not aligned. Electoral democracy, let's talk a little bit about that. Free and fair elections, but with an important caveat. There is some fishy stuff. Vote buying happens on both sides. BJP has done some stuff with election funding to manipulate the process so that opposition parties can't get money as easily. We've got Jammu Kashmir where people they can't vote right now, and that might change. And then with our anti-corruption party in Delhi, they've done something interesting there, which is for all of these states, there's a nominal head, but they've said for Delhi that nominal head, who's a politically appointed person from the center, that person should have more power. And so right now, our anti-corruption party pretty much only has control over the education policy in Delhi. They've lost out control over the police. They've lost out control over a lot of infrastructure. The things that you would expect a party to control at the state level, and every other state has that. Our Aam Aadmi Party folks have lost that control. A big threat to Indian federalism, to say nothing of the political situation. So this gets us now more to the scholarly literature, I would say. One of the debates that came out from what we were talking about was whether we should still call India a democracy, right? Levitsky and Way, this is a popular term. Is this competitive authoritarianism, what I've just described? Or is this some kind of illiberal democracy? Our group, for the most part, was split on this. Some people maintained that because of what was going on, even though there are free and fair elections, they're not as free or as fair as we might expect. And because of the violations in civil liberties and other dimensions, we don't really have what we would consider to be democracy. Other people said that the machinery still works for democracy. We have elections, people can get out and vote, candidates are allowed to stand. What we don't have is an illiberal democracy. And this, for the most part right now, is where the literature, I would say, on democracy is divided. This is what we were seeing with our own people as well. It's not a crisp distinction. It's more of a labeling sort of thing, right? But it still matters quite a lot. And of course, we've got majoritarian democracy as well. And why this matters is because if we think that, in this sort of situation, it's typically a leader who's manipulating the population. In this situation, the leader is merely a manifestation of the population, right? Is the problem with the people themselves, or is it a problem with the leadership? That's something that a lot of literature right now is sort of divided over. So here are a couple of books that we've seen. These aren't daggers drawn. It could definitely be both that's happening. We've got Drake Thatchell and others, for instance, who writes about how BJP is able to buy off voters using the RSS machinery to provide various forms of aid. And then we've got other people like Thomas Blom Hansen, who wrote for the book, and was a professor here, Christoph Dracula, who edited this book, about how the BJP is more of a manifestation of on-the-ground sorts of campaigning. Hindutva is appealing to voters. So we're seeing a lot of literature right now, sort of questioning in this dimension. What would we need to sort of settle this? Well, we don't really have reliable public surveys coming out of India. To say the least, it's very hard to survey 1.2 billion people, 1.3 billion people. The surveys that are done are either internal to the BJP. The other parties don't really run surveys, as far as I know, at national level, or they're usually puff pieces that the media is doing for some calculation or another. Academic research, we see good local level surveys and state level surveys. I haven't seen too many good national level surveys, even among scholars. So it could be that both of these views are true, that the BJP is cheating, and it could be that the BJP is sort of reacting to what people want. It could also vary temporally. So when Tariq wrote his book, when BJP was coming in 2012, Tariq was saying that this sort of manipulation was happening. It's very clear now, however, that Modi BJP, at least anecdotally, have succeeded in pushing a vision of India, a vision of Hinduism, Hindutva, that goes beyond just the ballot box. You see, for instance, Emmerich Davies, I think came last year. He's written a lot about how they're changing textbooks. They're trying to redefine this, right? So it's part of a larger project. So they could have come in through manipulation and cheating, but now they could be actually getting sort of traction among a popular view. I've got a paper on this with Georgie, one of the contributors of the book, and when I was a CDDR postdoc, we were in the same room together. He looks at Modi's Twitter presence. And so we did this paper where we looked at Modi pre his election or pre his campaign in 2014 to post. Basically what happens when he decides to run for a national figure is he starts to use images like that with Obama's bio next to him, really downplays all of the pro-Hindu, anti-Muslim rhetoric that really defined him while he was in Gujarat. We're starting to see that come back now, but for a good chunk of time, I'd say really the first 4 or 5 years, it was more about trying to look like what an international leader should look like, right? He wasn't using Twitter to promote his vision of what India should be. Now we see a lot more of that returning, that kind of, shall we say, vitriol. That's coming back on his Twitter platform. So there's evidence that Hindutva seems to be deepening, seems to be resonating. So some work I'm doing on, this is a little quick tangent, on promoting unity. Eric and I take students from the law school out to these classrooms that we've got, that we work with, set up across northern India. About 60,000 students come to the system. I'm working with Prashant Loyalka, who's a FSI senior fellow at the education school. He's really interested in designing a unity curriculum. If you think that this kind of cultural divide is happening, the question is how can you teach something that goes against it? So we're trying out a lot of different things, drawing on the literature on how to deal with prejudice, on how to recognize common virtues. And we're thinking about experiments that we can design to see what kinds of mechanisms, what kinds of lesson design work best in this space. It's still pretty new research, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to take you to coffee if you've got good ideas for us. And we've done some other experiments there now, but it should be a pretty fun project. And actually, a lot of those classrooms are set up in UP, so we could even do some things right around the election at the same time. All right, so we talked about the status of Indian democracy. We've talked about prevailing theories of democracy and democratic decline. And now I'm really going to go out on a bit of a limb here, if you don't mind. Do what political scientists aren't supposed to do ever, right? What's going to happen? So in 2004, 2024, almost to a person, our contributors, for the most part, they think that Modi and the BJP are going to return. And they think they're going to return to the majority government. They're not going to have to really form an alliance outside of their immediate friends. Actual policies really don't seem to matter that much. So Modi has survived slow growth, a really big debacle where he pulled all the money of the country, 90% of the money, and didn't really, people didn't have currency for about 6 weeks. Huge agriculture protests have been going on. He's liberalized the markets there. If you're paying attention to Indian news in March, April, just disastrous COVID response. A lot of that response, by the way, the fault of it was because they routed all decisions through the PMO, even though they've got a very technical, competent bureaucracy for dealing with epidemics and pandemics. And then, of course, international flare-ups with China and Pakistan, where oftentimes India actually loses. You would think that if you're trying to project a strongman image of a country, you can't lose to the Muslims from Pakistan, but lo and behold, Modi's maintained a strong political standing throughout all of these kinds of things. Of course, the question should be asked, if Modi thought he wasn't going to return to power, if he didn't think he could win elections, what would happen to the electoral processes in the country? Would he really be so brazen as to cross the line and interfere with political processes, election processes? He could. I think the evidence suggests that he could, but maybe he wouldn't. It's really hard to say. Unfortunately, the international community isn't too well positioned to say very much to check these kinds of civil liberty threats that we see. Modi and Biden last week were pictured hugging one another on the world stage at COP, outside of COP. I think we'll see some kinds of checks on it, especially on low-level sorts of things. So when Trump was in India, right before COVID hit in February of 2020, when he landed in Delhi, the BJP actually caused a riot that killed about 5 or 10 people, I think. And Trump was silent on the matter, even though it was, at the time he was in the city and everything like that. I don't think something like that would happen under Biden's watch. Biden would be forced to respond to it. But the larger situation at play suggests that the US wouldn't really be that involved or that vocal in it. And Europe doesn't seem to have much of an appetite for it either, for the same reasons that the US isn't really thinking too much about it. It seems like most people want to look beyond it and work with Modi. So what happens after Modi? Modi is 72, and he's a portly fellow, to say the least. I've seen both Chris Christie and Narendra Modi in person, and Modi actually gives him a run for his money. This is his number 2, is Amit Shah, and the cartoon does justice to showing that Amit Shah is actually a bigger fellow. So, this is a possibility that these folks could not be there one day. Amit Shah also has all kinds of heart issues. There are no obvious successors. There's a possibility that they find a good successor and Hindutva carries on. It certainly seems to be politically palatable. There's an alternative outcome with the RSS and the BJP fracture. Either between the two organizations, RSS finds another party, or the BJP splinters. It's difficult to see at this stage, largely because the party is really ideologically and organizationally very coherent. It's difficult to see that happen. We've never seen the BJP ever have really lose people like that, or come up and create rival parties as they have with Congress. But never say never. I think this is one of the big questions. Can we really see a counter narrative to this Hindu ideology? And what would an opposition party look like? Would it have to be an amalgamation of regional parties? Would it have to be Congress having new life breathed into it? These are some of the questions that I think are going to define Indian democracy, as well as how we think about democracy globally as scholars. So in sum, world's largest democracy, I think all people would agree it's being tested. Some people might not even call it a democracy at this stage, but it's being tested. There's all kinds of interesting research opportunities in this space. And I'm just going to end by saying that scholars, especially at CDTRL, I think, need to play an important advocacy role. So Joyji, for instance, I'll tell you his story. He got tenure at Michigan, but wanted to relocate to India. And he was working for Microsoft Research there. And last year he was doing some stuff that got him chased out of the country. And now he's thankfully back at Michigan. But that's not what should be happening to our people. We actually, a couple of our other contributors have had similar kinds of experiences at this stage. And it's, I don't know, perhaps downright scary how it's affecting academics, but it's 10 times worse for people who aren't. If you're interested in the book, it's probably going to come out in a year or so, year and a half. These are the contributors, these are the chapters, these are the themes: politics, state, and society. This follows what their structure was in 2007, but as you can tell, it covers what's going on for the most part pretty thoroughly. So happy to talk about this, happy to talk about what's going on in India, happy to talk about what's happened in India. Thank you.
Great, awesome. So I will start a list, but we have, the first question is from Frank online. Can you say more about the sociology of support for the BJP? His understanding is that's largely middle class, which would weaken modernization theory. While the real support for democracy comes from the scheduled castes and poor.
Yeah, so sociology of BJP support. Well, this is, as I've talked about with regard to Indian democracy, Barrington Moore's book didn't really travel all that well to India, which is sort of sad. We don't really have a middle class in India when democracy is taking root, certainly in the 1950s. Today, so the middle class, there is an emerging middle class. It's largely the kids that I'm actually running experiments with. It is emerging. It doesn't seem to be a cohesive political identity where they're asking for similar kinds of things. In terms of the BJP's support from various caste groups, there are different explanations, but they've clearly been able to co-opt lower caste members. And it's weird because you would think that an organization that preaches Hinduism in its original form, which means the caste structure, wouldn't be able to gain so much traction with the lower castes. Modi, however, has been able to do that for a couple of reasons. One of them, and the most important, is he's been able to appeal to lower castes by saying that we should get rid of the caste system. Of course, when he says that, he also says that we should put in reservations so that lower castes, OBCs, I don't like using this term, but original backward castes, which is the legal term for it, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, which makes up a majority of the Indian population, Hindu population, that they should get various sinecures that are reserved for them.
All right.
Can I finger on this?
Signature?
Sorry. So I had a similar question, but I was more interested in like the kind of political geography of like support for the BJP. Like, could you speak more to like, is it like more urban or more rural like support, like economically booming or declining areas, like on those dimensions?
So it's geographically tied towards, I would still say, the language areas. So the northern India Hindi belt is where we see it. Urban, rural, not much of a divide. Economically, not much of a divide.
Interesting.
And the party itself, while we call it a right-wing party, it's not an economically ideological right-wing party. They do right-wing things. They privatized some companies. They pushed for free market reform in the agricultural space, but then they also do very lefty things. Things like reservations for various businesses. They just increased tariffs, which we haven't seen happen in India in 25 years. So ideologically, economically, ideologically, it's not very clear. And so that's partly why maybe they see that voters don't really care as much about those kinds of things.
Right, Eric, and then Kevin.
So Dinsha, thanks for this synthesis. It's really good, but it's really dreary. And I only see two macro prospects for change, and I think they're both highly unlikely. One is
Modi's getting to us.
one is a unification of opposition. And I see that as highly unlikely, but in the 90s and early 2000s, political scientists were just constantly talking about political fragmentation and how there couldn't be consolidation. Well, the BJP figured that out, right? I just wonder if there could be a counter narrative of unification of the opposition, because frankly, the opposition doesn't have a shot at overwhelming the BJP without unification.
Yep.
The other prospect for change that I see is a crisis so deep and unpredictable that somehow it realigns the politics. But as you rightly point out, Modi's done all sorts of wonky policy things. I mean, really crazy demonetization and its treatment of COVID and the like. He's weathered all of that. But can you speculate on a crisis that might be deep enough to dislodge the equilibrium?
And can I two-finger on the first question? So Karis is online, also former CDL person, who now is over at Hoover, and he's saying the astounding feature of BJP dominance is how low the party's national vote share has been, since they've translated like 31% and 37% of votes into majorities in the parliament. So what will it take to get opposition coordination? Either what do we know from theories of comparative politics or from empirically when have those parties been able to coordinate?
Yeah. Okay. Crisis so deep, really hard to see one, especially, I thought COVID would do it, especially in April, May. I mean, just the extent of how bad India was hit during that time period, it can't be overstated. It's getting calls at night, and I'm 2 years removed from India. I haven't been there in quite a while. And I was just getting calls at night, every night. Oh, somebody's died. Oh, two of my friends have died. 2 of my coworkers have died. 3 of my coworkers have died. If that doesn't galvanize people, it's hard to say what would. Maybe some kind of security threat, maybe a real economic downturn, far more dramatic than what we saw at the beginning of COVID, which itself, I think they lost 7% growth last year, or 8% growth, along with a lot of human tragedy there. So hopefully, I mean, let's never hope for a crisis, but it would have to be really something that would be quite striking. In terms of the opposition, the unification of the opposition, I think Karis's point and this unification get back to the same thing that these regional parties aren't that well organized, especially at the national level. And typically they've fallen behind Congress party and taken the lead from there. Congress has done most of the large scale organizing. Congress doesn't have that capability anymore. And Congress also just wants to be that party, right? And so they expect if they go into a power sharing agreement that Rahul Gandhi will get prime ministership, or even in the state level, that Congress people will have a seat at the table. They tend not to be willing to give up, especially in their historical domination, places of domination. They tend not to, not want to field a candidate, for instance. And so because of that lack of unification, that's going to pose some problems. With regard to what Kara said, the BJP actually has, relatively speaking, as well as in absolute terms, really sophisticated machinery. It allows them to identify what voters want to hear on the ground in ways that we don't see with Congress or really for the regional parties. It's true with 31%, 37% that they've been able to take the country. It's true that in UP, where they dominate, it's a state that's 25% Muslim, right? You wouldn't expect that. And so they're able to win with these majorities by figuring out the people who they know they can turn out, giving them the right message. I've talked to BJP people who do polling for them, and they actually, at a national level, it's a lot of Hindutva stuff, but at a local level, they'll be talking about economics to the people who want to hear economics. It'll be, jobs to the people who want to hear jobs. It'll be security to the people, very few people who care about security, but it'll be security. And so they're very good at modulating their message locally. They also know, for instance, in the rural areas, it tends to be more strongman based, how to co-opt the local strong people, versus in the urban areas, oftentimes you need to go door to door. They understand that kind of machinery or that kind of politicking at a level that other political parties just don't seem to understand.
So you kind of hit on some of what I was going to ask you about, which is, where would social cleavages be at the national level so that other parties might be able to exploit them? So, is it, there's tremendous inequality, right, in India. Is it that? Is there any hope for that? Is there, corruption, security of the environment? Right now, the air quality is horrendous, right, in some parts of big cities. So why wouldn't people mobilize on those things? And it strikes me as a highly mobilized society historically. So if he's not using force against people, well, I guess he is, right? And the law against people who might take to the streets. So then, are there? I guess the question is, are there any sort of cleavages that could galvanize some people? And then how would that get organized politically in the face of such weak opposition? And why is, you mentioned that the alternative view here might be that, in fact, Hindutva is appealing to people. And so if I think about comparing that to American or Hungarian politics, is there any similarity there? Are they worried that, for example, that suddenly Muslims are going to be taking jobs away from Hindus, or is it even more racist than that, fundamentally? So, and why now in particular? Is it the same kinds of trends like robotization that might actually be taking the jobs, or why now?
Great questions. Yeah, so actually I should mention the agriculture protests, just a footnote in one of the slides. Delhi's been actually surrounded by farmers leading protests for the last year and a half. And yet we haven't seen much national level sort of galvanization around that. The farmers groups claim that they have national level representation, but for the most part, Modi's been able to paint it as a two-state sort of issue, checking the other 30 states in terms of what they feel like. The farmers who are protesting are mostly from the states of Punjab and Haryana. But the capital city has been surrounded, and I wouldn't call it under siege, but they've made sure that food shipments don't come in and things like that happen. So there are definitely people who feel disaffected by that government. there are definitely cleavages that the parties could try and take advantage of. Punjab has also got their elections coming up in 2022. I don't think BJP plans to do very well there. I wouldn't be counting on it based on what's happened with the agricultural protests. So maybe they've written off that state, but again, if they figure out the right 30% to vote for them, 40% to vote for them, they can come in huge ways. In terms of how Hindutva is appealing, there is a little bit on jobs. It hasn't been as much about that. There are certainly economic factors at play that matter. India has always had a shortage of jobs, and still to this day, the government actually covers up these statistics, but it's not a job producing country to the extent that they need jobs for their demographic dividend. So they've been doing that, but I think there's just also just a lot of resentment that we're seeing now towards Muslims that go beyond economic, a lot of rhetoric that we can't just fit into sort of a economic expectation. There's a rising push that minorities, and particularly Muslims, have to be checked, have to be watched out, all kinds of things. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I get a little bit of a window into this because of the NGO that I work with. Hearing people who are completely normal, who I enjoy interacting with when they go and set up a school in a Muslim neighborhood, the way they describe these kinds of processes, it's not the way you want to hear how these things go. So it's concern. Hopefully we can think about some ways to counter that through education.
Nick.
I really enjoyed learning about what's going on in India. I'm always struck by the vertical integration of the BJP, particularly with the RSS. And I as you mentioned, I mean, I can't really think of any sort of analogs elsewhere in the world. And so I guess my question is like, how much of these trends, this sort of decline in democracy in India, is really just about these opposition parties wilting in the face of a superior bureaucratic organization? And if so, do these parties like the Congress have plans to sort of build out an analogous organization like the RSS or something that really reaches deep into Indian society in order to, as you were mentioning, sort of indoctrinate kids starting at age 6 or 7, bring them up through the party ranks? Because that to me, less the ideological stuff, but the really, the organizational capacity seems to be the key difference. And the BJP is just vastly superior in that regard.
It seems to be. I can tell you another story. So when I was living in Gujarat in 2011, 2012, one of my friends was hired as a consultant to a very low-level bureaucracy project in education. She would write blogs, and she was actually pro-BJP, but she wrote a blog that loosely questioned what Modi was doing, and this is when he was chief minister. And she was out of a job, and she had somebody, a police officer at her house the next day. There was like 2 people who probably read her blog, right? And they found that, which is really incredible to me. I mean, the reach is just astounding sometimes with some of this stuff. It seems like the other party structures, they're being undone for reasons that are partly internal, right? Congress certainly deserves its blame for its own collapse, but now BJP has done other things to stymie them as well. Let me pick up on a theme that I think other people have talked about as well, which is corruption. BJP, for the most part, the form of corruption that we've seen, and this is anecdotal because we don't really have very much evidence, the form of corruption that we've seen among the BJP is mostly money going into party coffers, right? There's not a lot of evidence that Modi has been personally enriching himself. He actually set up something called the Prime Minister Cares Fund, which if you're a large corporation and you donate to that, you don't have to pay the same level of taxes that you would otherwise. And so he set up this parallel sort of funding structure that's actually quite robust. As versus Congress in their second term, 2009 to 2014, I think Tarek, but other people as well, they had these great quotes where Congress leaders were basically saying, this is the end. Macy Chapati does this. This is the end. We're going to take as much as we can get, and money we won't make go into the party coffers. And they didn't have the ability to enforce where that money was ending up. So the parties are also underfunded at this point. It's not clear where that money could come from, apart from winning some local and state elections to make up for it. Big donors are hesitant to give to parties that aren't going to be in power, that might also be checked by the opposition. So money is also a big issue as to why these parties probably won't be able to come back. In terms of a parallel structure to the RSS, I would love to see something like that. Just, normatively, I probably shouldn't jump into it. I haven't seen any kind of discussion like that. Ahmadiyya has talked a little bit about doing it, but at their local levels.
Marissa?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on these kinds of questions about the party organization. In Latin America, we saw major parties disappear and people wrote about party collapse. Would you describe the Congress Party as a case of that? And the idea is that the parties sort of diluted what they stood for, they colluded on policies, they adopted policies that were inconsistent with their previous argument, previous platforms. And also, in terms of party organization, the way that these large parties have typically reached into every neighborhood in Latin America is through clientelism, maybe some through the unions, but mostly through clientelism. Is there not that option available in India?
Yeah, good questions. So actually a lot of the literature on Latin America party formation, I think, was specifically informed by Congress. We haven't had a great biography or history of Congress written, I would say, since probably the 1990s. Again, like rich, fertile ground for more scholarship. So we don't have a lot of people who weighed in on the decline of Congress. Part of it is it's just happened so quickly. They were the national party until 2014, and now they're nothing, right? So it seems like something happened where it just fell off a cliff. But you can see some elements that go back a little bit before that, where they undermined the local party machinery. Myron Weiner and Atul Kohli have written a lot about this, where Myron Weiner went to these 5 villages in the 60s, and they all had really exciting offices, local party offices. If you had any kind of need from the state, you'd get it there. Kohli went back in the 80s to those exact same offices, and he found they were all locked up, right? Because Indira was centralizing the party at that point. And so they got out of that business. They got out of the local sort of game of trying to be in every neighborhood and trying to provide local level clientelism for the most part.
Could you go back to, is there a opportunity to go back to that? Is there a demand for clientelism still in India?
I would think so.
Yeah.
Promises tend to be sort of hollow. So they promise the world, and these parties, historically, none of them have really delivered, including the BJP, I would say. But you could go back towards that. Saad has been looking at, Saad Gulzar in the political science department has been looking at some of this as well. So you could go back to that. You could see some kind of reversion. Congress would have an uphill fight in terms of building out that structure, even at local levels. Like Delhi used to be one of their strong points. And they're wiped off the map there too.
One last thing. Is RSS like Muslim Brotherhood? Or is it?
I don't want my house to get fired.
No, I know, but like a religious political organization that's in every neighborhood. Is that not a good analogy? I'm trying to understand what.
Yeah, not nationally, but they have presence throughout much of the country, and they'll do all kinds of things. It's more than just a political movement. They'll do calisthenics in the morning, and they'll do marches in the afternoon, and it's just got a membership subscription has shot through the roof over the last few years, as you might imagine. But it's a social club as well. Yeah.
Marcel?
Yeah, I have 2 comments. The first one is if Modi is successful because he's a very good political entrepreneur, whatever methods he's using can be good. Just an observation that the others can learn. The second one is about, I had a question about something you raised at the beginning about Gandhi and his kind of creedal, I think you say creedal for him with. I wanted you to elaborate a bit on that. Is it related to I remember when I was living in India, I was surprised people would say, oh yeah, this person is a Muslim, but we know what caste they are. But basically it was like a all-encompassing caste view of the world. So where no matter can hide behind a label as Christian or whatever. That was still
yeah. And I don't mean to be misleading, especially with Congress. They were playing similar kinds of politics too. Maybe not at the national level when they were trying to build what they call the secular country. They inserted that term into the constitution in the 70s. But certainly at the local levels, you would hear them, if it behooved them to talk to a Hindu community about Muslim threats at the local level, they would do that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or play in the caste dynamics in ways that benefited them. Gandhi himself always struggled with how Hinduism and caste should be connected. He wrote extensively on this, and when you write extensively, you sometimes become contradictory. And he's 300 volumes of writings. There's a lot of that. So the larger overarching way that his image is presented and how his legacy was used, especially post 48, post his assassination, is seen as a let's promote togetherness, coming together of the country, especially. I mean, he died during Hindu-Muslim riots when they were taking over the country, and he was going out trying to stop Hindu beating up Muslim and vice versa. So his legacy, which might not be accurate as to what he was actually writing about, his legacy is certainly one of those kinds of unifying legacies. But he certainly was cognizant and struggled with issues like caste.
My question was whether, it would have surprised me, but whether his vision was that, oh, okay, so we're gonna make secular varnas. Everybody is in one of the varnas, no matter what your religion is. So it becomes a non-religious view of caste.
Yes, India has always said that secularism to them doesn't mean a separation of church and state. It means something else. It means something specific to India. At the same time as Gandhi was saying secularism is important, the state was saying we control all of the temples of this country. And Gandhi was saying, using that, we should allow any caste, any woman as well to be able to enter the temples, right? Which he's getting involved in religious politics directly in that, right? But that's to advance, to break down what he thought was improper cultural practices within Hinduism. He wasn't saying a separation should be there, but he was saying that Hinduism itself as a religion should trend towards something that might be more secular. I should have explained that.
Nishan?
Dinsha, thank you very much. This was very engaging, and very informative, and also very concise. So I commend you for your presentation. I'll try to be really quick, but whenever we talk about this question of any type of discussion around declining democracies, democratic recessions, there seems all the discussion seems to converge around this master narrative that you have a situation where the political class is getting discredited. There are all these governance problems, socioeconomic grievances that the state is unable to respond to. The political class, the established political parties are discredited. And then some enterprising politician ends up riding the right-wing populist wave, and they end up coming to power. They mess up with the horizontal institutions of accountability, et cetera, and then we're in that concerning situation that everyone is raising alarm about. I would love to ask you, like, as someone who has had a long-standing scholarly engagement with India, like, in what respects do you feel India converges with that narrative, and what sense does it diverge? And also, like, if this becomes our guide to understanding, the political realities in India at the moment, at that national macro level, what nuances and idiosyncrasies and contingencies do we miss?
Yeah,
that becomes our lens.
Yeah, so this is a great question. This ties, I think, to questions that Catherine was asking about how maybe the ideology looks like US and Hungary, but we can think about whether populist movements in general, what kind of narratives and rhetorics they use to come to power. Modi didn't really reject the political class. He's rejected corruption. So the demonetization movement was to a nameless, faceless enemy, black money, right? They were taking out money from the system to go after black money. But he himself wasn't saying it's these rich entrenched elites. He's been very careful not to do that. He hasn't gone after the Bombay rich classes either, even though sometimes they go against his own interests. These powerful businesses he's been respectful of. So he hasn't gone against them in the way that we've seen other leaders in other places do it. And it doesn't really fit either his personal strategy or his political interests, I would say. We can talk more about that later. So in that respect, he's not a typical populist, tear everything down, trying to, change everything. Much more, he's been trying to actually take that legacy and bend it towards his purposes. So he's built a statue, for instance, of Vallabhbhai Patel, which is twice the size of the Statue of Liberty. Patel was, they're trying to recast his legacy, the rightful person who should have been prime minister instead of Nehru. Patel is this figure in Congress party who is more of a technocrat. He gets all the princes to give up their land towards building the Indian state, has some rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, but not too much. He's actually the person who allows the RSS to come back to power. And he's built a statue of this guy. At the feet of that statue every year now with World Bank funding, they bring the first class, they bring the entering members for the top levels of the Indian bureaucracy. And Modi meets with each of those folks individually for 30 minutes, basically at the shoe of this ridiculous statue. And so these kinds of things, if you're looking for nuance, I can tell you more about that, but you can imagine the kind of indoctrination for the steel frame that was supposed to be apolitical and has historically been a check on political power and ideology, how he's trying to co-opt the state into that using historical legacy. It's also tried to co-opt Gandhi to a certain extent. It's always been a little bit tense and tough, but he's doing that, right? So things like that are happening. He's not rejecting that previous legacy in the way that other populists would.
Awesome. Well, we have another event happening in this room at 12:45. So Jamie's final question, unless there's one that I missed. No, go ahead. We still have.
So Dinsha, I want to ask you about maybe give more detailed communications methods. Struck by your evolution to kind of retail vertical politics. Not surprising given the demographics, but also obviously social media is huge. Superficially, these looks like two sort of ends of a scale, but access to technology being pretty widespread, but probably not. But I was just interested in the mechanisms by which messages, variegated as you describe them, are delivered, and if there are, if the analytic part, if there are some interesting comparative lessons there. Kind of tapped on the analytic part. So those are just the question.
I mean, social media is one of the few platforms. Typically, in the US, when we analyze political rhetoric and speech, we've got the recordings, we've got the transcripts that even, back in the day, they would run the speeches in the newspapers, right? In India, historically, we haven't had that. So now with social media, we've got people going on the record for the first time in ways that are actually recorded, right? It's not like politicians never spoke in front of crowds before. It's just that because literacy was so low or whatever it might be, we just really don't know what they were saying. So we're able to trace what politicians and even bureaucrats now, as well as other people in society are saying in ways that we never could before. Some of the interesting dynamics that Joyjeet in particular has been writing about is basically about how various celebrities and leaders outside of the political establishment have really become mouthpieces for the government in various ways, in concerning ways. And this has huge ramifications. If you're getting Bollywood stars who really do have huge political followings or huge followings to say that you're a great person and this project is really spectacular, that has a pretty big impact. And some of the people who haven't played ball, for instance, probably India's biggest Hollywood celebrity, Shah Rukh Khan, who doesn't tweet praiseful images about BJP. His son is in jail right now on trumped up drug charges. They didn't even find drugs on the boy, but he's in jail right now. So, if you can go against striking against Shah Rukh Khan, that speaks to your political power, even beyond just the government. So.
All right, well, Dinsha, thank you so much for this great presentation. Thanks, everyone.
I wish I could